Hello, everyone. Today we're going to step into a story that begins with the sound of church bells echoing against a gray sky. The kind of sound that seems to stretch time itself. I remember standing at the gates of the cemetery, my hands clutching a small bouquet that trembled not from the wind, but from the weight pressing down on my chest. Faces blurred around me, some wet with tears, others stiff with silence. The ground smelled damp, heavy from the morning rain, as if the earth itself was preparing to swallow another secret. This wasn't just a funeral, it was my husband's funeral. And in that moment, everything inside me wanted to collapse. But grief has a strange way of sharpening the senses. I saw too much, noticed too much. The smallest shift in people's posture, the faintest murmur that floated just behind me, the way the priest's voice cracked as though he carried knowledge of more than just prayers. The image is still vivid, my black shoes sinking slightly into the softened earth, the coffin lowering inch by inch, and me whispering his name under my breath, hoping that somehow he could hear me. The finality of it all should have been the end, but it was only the beginning. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And please, let me know in the comments where and when you're listening to this story. Because sometimes, the place we are when we hear a story changes the way it lands in our hearts. As people lined up to offer condolences, I tried to listen, to nod, to be polite. But my body was numb, almost disconnected. Their words flowed past me like smoke, except one. A whisper that slipped through the air, too soft for anyone else to notice, but sharp enough to cut through the fog in my mind. Finally, it's over. I froze. My eyes scanned the crowd, trying to trace the voice, but the faces melted into one another. A widow is supposed to grieve, not suspect. Yet there it was, that single sentence that would haunt me more than the coffin disappearing into the ground. The atmosphere shifted then. Sympathy turned to suspicion, comfort to unease. I caught glimpses of glances that didn't match the sorrow on their lips. Some eyes lingered too long on me, others darted away when I looked back. The funeral, meant to be a moment of closure, instead opened a door I hadn't known existed. When I finally placed the bouquet on the coffin, my hands no longer trembled from grief alone. They trembled from a new, sharp fear. The fear that my husband's death wasn't just an ending, but a key to something hidden, something waiting. I walked away from the cemetery with more than sorrow pressed against my ribs. I carried the whisper, the glances, and the weight of knowing that what had just begun would change everything I thought I understood about love, loss, and betrayal. The night after the funeral, I lay awake in the bedroom that suddenly felt too large, too hollow. The bed still held the shape of his absence, a dent where he once slept, and the faint scent of his cologne still clung to the pillow beside me. I closed my eyes, hoping for silence, but instead, the whisper I had heard at the cemetery kept replaying, word for word. Finally, it's over. It wasn't the kind of phrase one says in mourning. It wasn't grief. It was relief. But why? Relief for what? Or for whom? I tried to brush it away as exhaustion, as the paranoia of a grieving widow. But the more I thought about it, the more my chest tightened. People cry at funerals. People murmur prayers. They don't whisper things that sound like celebration. That thought alone sent a chill crawling down my spine. The next day, when I went downstairs to pour myself some coffee, I noticed something strange. Neighbors and relatives lingered outside longer than usual. Their conversations hushed whenever I appeared, like I had stepped into a play where everyone else knew the script but me. Their pity didn't feel like kindness anymore. It felt like a mask. I forced myself to revisit the faces from the funeral. my sister-in-law's fleeting smile as she adjusted her coat, my husband's closest friend staring at the ground too intently, the neighbor who held me a little too tightly when she hugged me goodbye. At the time, I had been too broken to care. But now, with the whisper echoing in my ears, every expression, every gesture, felt loaded with meaning. Later that afternoon, I sat by the living room window, watching the street outside. I told myself I was waiting for silence, but in truth, I was waiting for something, or someone, to slip, to reveal themselves. When grief meets suspicion, time stretches, every second becoming a chance for truth to crawl out of hiding. And then, it happened again. As I prepared dinner alone, something simple, because appetite had abandoned me, I heard another voice. This one wasn't in my head. It came from outside the window, a hurried conversation between two people walking past my house. "She'll find out eventually," one voice said. "She won't," the other replied quickly. "Not unless someone tells her." I dropped the knife I was holding. The clatter against the cutting board jolted me, but it couldn't drown out the weight of those words. My breath caught in my throat. Find out what? What secret was there left to hide now that my husband was gone? I pressed myself against the wall, careful not to make a sound as the voices faded down the street. For the first time since the funeral, fear eclipsed my grief. My husband had been many things to me: my partner, my confidant, my safe place. And now he was gone, leaving behind not only his absence, but also shadows of truths I didn't know existed. I whispered to the empty room, as if he could still hear me. "What were you hiding from me?" The silence that followed was unbearable. That night, sleep never came. Instead, I sat at his desk, running my fingers over the stacks of unopened mail, the faint scratches on the wooden surface, the lingering imprint of his life. The whisper from the funeral and the conversation outside collided in my head until they became a single question that I couldn't shake. Who had been waiting for his death? And why? I knew then that this was no longer just mourning. It was the beginning of a search, one that would demand answers I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. The third morning without him began with an eerie quiet. Sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, casting thin, fractured beams across the floorboards. It should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like the house was holding its breath. I sat at the dining table, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. My hands gripped the porcelain so tightly that warmth bled into my skin, grounding me. But my mind was adrift, circling back to the same puzzle. The whisper, the strange conversation outside, the looks exchanged at the funeral. When you grieve, you expect sorrow, maybe anger. But what I felt was something sharper: suspicion. That afternoon, I forced myself to return to the cemetery. I told anyone who asked that I wanted to bring fresh flowers, but the truth was different. I wanted to see if someone might return there too. Places of death draw the living in strange ways. The groundskeeper greeted me with a polite nod, but his eyes betrayed something else, something cautious, almost pitying. As I placed the bouquet at the headstone, I sensed eyes on me again. Not from strangers passing by, but from people I knew. A few rows away, my sister-in-law, dressed in muted gray, pretended to examine another grave. Her presence was too convenient, her movements too rehearsed. She didn't notice me watching, or maybe she wanted me to notice. I couldn't tell which was worse. Back at the house, the unease grew. Visitors trickled in, neighbors, relatives, even old colleagues of my husband's. Their condolences followed the same script, as if memorized. But it was the way some of them looked at me that made my stomach twist. Not pity, not compassion. It was expectation. as though I were a character in a play they were waiting to see perform her part. I excused myself more than once just to stand in the hallway, steadying my breathing. In the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Pale skin, tired eyes, lips pressed thin. But behind that reflection was something harder. A question forming, burning. What do they know that I don't? That evening, as the house emptied again, I replayed the day's faces in my head. My husband's best friend had avoided eye contact entirely, his voice too soft, too rehearsed. My cousin clutched my hand a little too long, whispering, "Stay strong." But her eyes flickered with something like guilt. Every glance, every gesture, felt like a thread. And together, they wove a tapestry of secrets, too tangled to ignore. I sat by the fireplace long after midnight, the flames casting restless shadows across the walls. My grief had become something else entirely, a determination to peel back the layers of this performance, to force the truth out of the silence. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized. Grief is heavy, but secrets are heavier. And the weight pressing down on me wasn't just loss. It was knowledge waiting to be uncovered. Who had been waiting for his death? And how many of them had been hiding it in plain sight, right before my eyes? The next morning, the house seemed to breathe differently. I woke to the sound of wind rattling against the windows, a low, unsettling hum that made the silence inside feel even heavier. I had avoided his study for days, but something in me shifted. Grief had dulled into a quiet resolve. If there were answers to be found, they would be there, among the things he left behind. The door creaked as I pushed it open. His study was untouched, as though he might walk in at any moment. Books leaned against each other on the shelves, stacks of papers lay neatly on the desk, and the scent of old leather and ink lingered in the air. It was a room of order, of control. But I knew, control often hides chaos beneath it. I began slowly, pulling open drawers, flipping through folders, brushing dust from envelopes that hadn't been touched in months. At first, it was nothing unusual. Receipts, letters from old friends, photographs yellowed at the edges. My heart ached as I touched them, the memories pressing against my ribs like bruises. But then, there it was, a thin envelope tucked beneath a pile of outdated newspapers. So ordinary, so forgettable, yet carefully hidden where no one would casually find it. My hands trembled as I pulled it free. The paper was worn, folded, and refolded, the edges fraying as though someone had clutched it in desperation. I sat down at his desk, my breath catching as I slid the letter open. The handwriting was his. I knew it instantly, the sharp angles of his letters, the occasional smudge where he pressed too hard. But the words were not the ones of a husband to his wife. They were distant, cryptic. Lines about regret, about promises made, about someone who had been waiting. One phrase stopped me cold. "You'll have what you wanted soon. Just wait a little longer." The room tilted. My fingers went numb, and I had to set the paper down to steady myself. Wait for what? Who was he writing to? I read it again and again, the words shifting meaning with every pass. Each time, the same weight pressed harder against me. My husband hadn't just been writing a letter. He had been leaving behind a message, one that pointed directly to someone outside of our marriage. Someone who was counting the days. I leaned back in his chair, staring at the shelves, the desk, the window that overlooked our garden. How many evenings had he sat there, writing letters like this, while I cooked dinner in the kitchen, humming to myself, believing in the illusion of our life together? The ache in my chest deepened. This wasn't just grief, It was betrayal seeping into the cracks of my heart. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and held it in my lap. It felt like holding fire, too dangerous to let go, too important to destroy. Outside, the wind rattled louder, as though urging me on. I whispered into the silence. "Who were you writing to?" The room, of course, gave no answer. Only the echo of my own voice and the steady, burning reminder that I was no longer just mourning a husband. I was unraveling a secret he had carried to his grave. And for the first time, I realized maybe I wasn't the only one who had been left behind. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. It pulsed in my mind like a wound that refused to close. Each word replayed itself until I knew the sentences by heart. "You'll have what you wanted soon. Just wait a little longer." The phrasing was too deliberate, too cold. It wasn't written to me, of that I was certain. But who then? I pulled out old photo albums, searching for answers in smiling faces and frozen memories. At first, everything looked ordinary. Vacations at the beach, holidays with family, birthdays where candles glowed brighter than the room around them. But as I lingered on each page, the images began to feel different. His arm around a friend lingered too long, his hand resting on a shoulder just a little too comfortably. Glances captured mid-frame that didn't belong to a man simply posing for a picture. Once, I would have dismissed these things. I would have laughed at myself for overthinking. But after the letter, after the whispers, I couldn't. I remembered the late nights he spent in that study, the phone calls he always ended quickly when I entered the room. I remembered the nights he told me he had to stay late at work, though he never looked tired when he came home. At the time, I believed him. That's what trust does. It blinds you to the edges of truth. One memory stood out above the rest. A dinner, just weeks before he fell ill. We had gone out with friends. I sat beside him, my hand resting on his. But when the conversation turned, I caught him staring at someone across the table. Not a quick glance. No. It was the kind of look that said more than words ever could. Back then, I had ignored it, convincing myself I was imagining things. But now, with the letter in my possession, I couldn't silence the suspicion anymore. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. The bed felt colder, emptier. I could almost hear his voice, not in comfort, but in deception. Every remembered smile twisted into something sharp, something false. The next morning, I poured myself coffee I didn't drink and sat staring at the garden outside. The roses he once tended bloomed beautifully, oblivious to the storm that brewed inside my chest. That was when the thought struck me. Grief had been my shield, but if I didn't act, I would drown in questions. So I returned to his study, determined to look deeper. Beneath the drawers, under the folders, I searched for anything I had missed. And then, tucked inside an old book, I found a train ticket stub dated just 3 months ago. The destination wasn't where he had told me he'd been that day. My stomach twisted as I realized he had been somewhere else entirely. It was as though his life had been layered, what I saw, what he told me, and beneath it all, the truth he kept hidden. The memories I clung to no longer added up. They weren't the story of our marriage. They were fragments of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. And now, piece by piece, that puzzle was forcing itself into the light. I folded the ticket stub between my fingers, feeling its thin edge cut into my skin. The whispers, the letter, the memories, they were no longer fragments. They were clues. And if I followed them, they would lead me to the answer I feared most. Who had been waiting for my husband's death? The days blurred together after that, each one marked not by hours, but by the weight of discoveries piling on top of me. The letter, the ticket stub, the memories that no longer made sense. It felt like grief had turned into a cruel scavenger hunt, and every clue pointed me toward a truth I wasn't ready to face. Still, I couldn't stop. I had to know. That evening, I decided to visit someone I hadn't spoken to in days, his longtime friend, Daniel. He had been a constant presence in my husband's life, always showing up at our door with a bottle of wine or calling just to check in. At the funeral, I had felt his eyes linger on me, not with sympathy, but with something else, something harder to name. When I called, his voice cracked slightly before he invited me over. He sounded nervous. Too nervous. Daniel's house was dimly lit, the curtains drawn even though the sun was still up. As I stepped inside, the air felt thick, heavy, with something unspoken. He poured me a drink without asking, his hands trembling just enough for me to notice. We sat across from each other in his living room. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched until I finally said, "You knew him better than most." "Tell me, Daniel, what was he hiding from me?" His glass paused halfway to his lips. A flicker of panic crossed his face before he forced a smile. "He wasn't hiding anything. He loved you." But his words were too quick, too rehearsed. I leaned forward. "Then why did he write to someone else? Why did he promise them something would happen soon?" The color drained from his face. He set the glass down carefully, as though afraid it might shatter between his fingers. "You found the letter," he muttered, almost to himself. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. For a moment, I thought he might confess everything right there. His shoulders slumped, his eyes darted toward the floor, and I could see the war inside him. But then he straightened, masking it all with a thin smile. "Grief makes us see shadows where there are none. Don't let it twist your memories." The words stung, not because I believed him, but because he was deflecting, hiding. His nervousness, the trembling, the way he avoided my eyes, it all screamed that he knew more than he was willing to say. I left his house with my heart pounding, my mind racing. If Daniel was involved, or if he knew who was, then the betrayal cut deeper than I imagined. It wasn't just my husband who had been lying to me. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the pieces refused to stay scattered. Daniel's silence, the ticket stub, the letter, they all pressed against one another like magnets. The picture forming in my mind was dark, unsettling. And worse, I realized I wasn't just searching for answers anymore. I was being watched. I had caught it earlier that day, walking back from Daniel's house. A figure across the street, lingering too long. A shadow slipping out of view when I turned my head. Someone was keeping track of me, just as I was trying to track the truth. The realization made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about grief. It wasn't just about betrayal. I was stepping into something larger, something that someone desperately wanted to keep buried. And if I wasn't careful, I could be the next one they were waiting on. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness that no amount of sleep could ease. My husband's study still carried the scent of secrets, and now, Daniel's evasive words echoed through my mind like a warning. If I wanted answers, I had to look where facts couldn't be denied. Paper, records, money. People lie, numbers rarely do. So I dressed, gathered the documents I had found, and walked into the bank where my husband had done his business for years. The lobby was sterile and quiet, the hum of machines blending with the low murmur of voices. I sat across from a banker who had known us by name, a man whose polite smile faltered when he realized I was there alone. "I need to review my husband's accounts," I said firmly, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "All of them." He hesitated. Policies, signatures, legal requirements, they were his shield. But widows carry a different kind of authority, one wrapped in grief and finality. After a moment, he nodded, disappeared into the back, and returned with folders thick enough to make my stomach twist. I flipped through statements, my eyes scanning lines of numbers that blurred together at first. Ordinary expenses. Mortgage payments, grocery stores, restaurants, and then large withdrawals, irregular transfers, amounts that didn't fit the rhythm of our life together. Money leaving our accounts and reappearing in places I had never heard of. One line stopped me cold. A transfer made just weeks before his death, to an account I didn't recognize. The beneficiary's name was unfamiliar, but the city was not. It was the same destination as the train ticket I had found tucked inside his book. The air in the office grew heavy, pressing down on me. I asked the banker who the account belonged to, but his lips tightened. "Confidential," he explained gently. He couldn't reveal that information without proper clearance. But I didn't need him to say it. The connection was too clear. The money, the ticket, the letter, all threads leading to the same shadow. Someone had been preparing, waiting, ensuring that when he was gone, they would not just inherit memories, they would inherit something tangible. I closed the folders slowly, my hands trembling, my heart racing. Every transfer felt like a betrayal etched in ink. While I was budgeting for groceries, he was feeding a hidden life. While I was saving for vacations we never took, he was preparing someone else's future. When I left the bank, the sun was blinding, the air too warm. My body moved on autopilot, but inside, I was unraveling. The world around me carried on as if nothing had changed, but mine had splintered beyond repair. At home, I spread the documents across the dining table. Each page was a confession he never spoke aloud. Each number whispered the same truth. I hadn't just lost my husband. I had lost the man I thought he was. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, clutching the letter in one hand and the bank statement in the other. Together, they formed a map of deceit, carefully drawn long before I noticed the cracks. And as I sat there, the question burned hotter than ever. Who was waiting for his death? The one who had his promises, his money, and perhaps even his heart. I had thought grief was the hardest battle I would face. But betrayal was far more suffocating. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. It pulsed in my mind like a wound that refused to close. Each word replayed itself until I knew the sentences by heart. "You'll have what you wanted soon. Just wait a little longer." The phrasing was too deliberate, too cold. It wasn't written to me, of that I was certain. But who then? I pulled out old photo albums, searching for answers in smiling faces and frozen memories. At first, everything looked ordinary. Vacations at the beach, holidays with family, birthdays where candles glowed brighter than the room around them. But as I lingered on each page, the images began to feel different. His arm around a friend lingered too long, his hand resting on a shoulder just a little too comfortably. Glances captured mid-frame that didn't belong to a man simply posing for a picture. Once, I would have dismissed these things. I would have laughed at myself for overthinking. But after the letter, after the whispers, I couldn't. I remembered the late nights he spent in that study. The phone calls he always ended quickly when I entered the room. I remembered the nights he told me he had to stay late at work, though he never looked tired when he came home. At the time, I believed him. That's what trust does. It blinds you to the edges of truth. One memory stood out above the rest. A dinner, just weeks before he fell ill. We had gone out with friends. I sat beside him, my hand resting on his. But when the conversation turned, I caught him staring at someone across the table. Not a quick glance. No. It was the kind of look that said more than words ever could. Back then, I had ignored it, convincing myself I was imagining things. But now, with the letter in my possession, I couldn't silence the suspicion anymore. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. The bed felt colder, emptier. I could almost hear his voice, not in comfort, but in deception. Every remembered smile twisted into something sharp, something false. The next morning, I poured myself coffee I didn't drink and sat staring at the garden outside. The roses he once tended bloomed beautifully, oblivious to the storm that brewed inside my chest. That was when the thought struck me. Grief had been my shield, but if I didn't act, I would drown in questions. So I returned to his study, determined to look deeper. Beneath the drawers, under the folders, I searched for anything I had missed. And then, tucked inside an old book, I found a train ticket stub dated just 3 months ago. The destination wasn't where he had told me he'd been that day. My stomach twisted as I realized he had been somewhere else entirely. It was as though his life had been layered, what I saw, what he told me, and beneath it all, the truth he kept hidden. The memories I clung to no longer added up. They weren't the story of our marriage. They were fragments of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. And now, piece by piece, that puzzle was forcing itself into the light. I folded the ticket stub between my fingers, feeling its thin edge cut into my skin. The whispers, the letter, the memories, they were no longer fragments. They were clues. And if I followed them, they would lead me to the answer I feared most. Who had been waiting for my husband's death? And with each new discovery, I felt that their eyes weren't just on him anymore. They were on me. The house had become a maze of echoes, letters in drawers, tickets in books, numbers on a screen. Each one was a fragment, but together they formed something undeniable. My husband had been preparing for someone else. Still, I needed proof that it wasn't only suspicion twisting in my mind. Proof that what I feared was real. That proof came the day I received a call from the lawyer. His tone was careful, measured, the way someone speaks when they know their words will unravel the listener. "There are some matters regarding your husband's estate," he explained. "It would be best if you came in." I dressed in silence, the weight of dread pressing down on me heavier than any grief. The office smelled faintly of leather and old books, the kind of place where secrets become signatures. The lawyer slid a folder across the desk toward me, his eyes steady but sympathetic. "This is his will," he said. My breath caught. I hadn't expected to hear those words so soon. With trembling hands, I opened the folder. The first pages were what I expected: our home, our savings, the things we had built together. But then, halfway down the list, my eyes froze. A name, not mine, not any relative I knew. A name I had never seen before. The lawyer continued speaking, explaining percentages and legal terms, but his words blurred into static. All I could see was that name, etched onto the paper like a confession he had never spoken aloud. My husband had chosen to leave something behind, not just for me, but for this other person. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely steady. The lawyer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "They were listed as a beneficiary. Beyond that, I cannot speculate." But I didn't need him to speculate. My heart already knew what my mind refused to accept. This wasn't random. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. Someone had been waiting for his death because he had left them something worth waiting for. I left the office with the folder clutched to my chest, the city around me spinning. Every honking car, every hurried pedestrian blurred into the background as I walked, numb. Betrayal had always been a word I thought belonged to stories told by others. Now, it was carved into my reality. Back at home, I spread the will across the table, the name staring back at me. I whispered it aloud, tasting its strangeness on my tongue. Who were they? What did they mean to him? The letter, the money, the calls, they all pointed here, to this moment, to this person. I leaned back in my chair, the house too quiet, the walls closing in. For the first time, I realized the truth might not come from documents or numbers alone. If I wanted answers, I would have to step out of the safety of suspicion and into the fire of confrontation. And that terrified me more than grief ever could. Because now, the betrayal had a name. And names are harder to forget. The name from the will burned in my mind, looping endlessly like a song I couldn't silence. I whispered it to myself over and over, as if repeating it would force the letters to rearrange, to turn into something less damning. But the truth was fixed, heavy, undeniable. This was the person my husband had been tethered to in secrecy, the one who had stood in the shadows of our marriage, waiting for his absence. I couldn't sleep. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw his coffin sinking into the ground, and behind it, faceless figures smiling in relief. My grief had transformed into something sharper, a need for confrontation. I had carried his secrets long enough. Now, I wanted theirs. The next day, I called Daniel. My voice trembled at first, but I steadied it. "We need to talk," I said. He hesitated before agreeing to meet at a small cafe on the edge of town. The place was quiet, nearly empty, with the smell of burnt coffee clinging to the air. Daniel looked older than I remembered, the lines on his face carved deeper, his eyes avoiding mine. He stirred his drink too much, the spoon clinking nervously against the cup. I didn't waste time. "Tell me about this name." I slid the folded copy of the will across the table. "Who are they? Why would my husband leave them anything?" For a moment, I thought he might deny it, laugh it off as a clerical error. But instead, his face paled. His hand tightened around the spoon until it stopped moving. "I don't think you want the answer," he said softly. The words stung. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." Daniel leaned back, sighing as though the weight of years pressed down on his chest. "He cared for them, more than you ever knew." The cafe seemed to shrink around me. My pulse thudded in my ears. Cared for them how? Silence. His eyes darted to the window, as if hoping someone would walk by and rescue him from the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, hesitant. "They were part of his life for a long time, longer than you realize. He made promises, promises he couldn't break, even when—" He trailed off, his throat tightening. I wanted to scream, to demand he say the words outright, but my voice cracked when I tried. "So, all those late nights, the trips, the phone calls?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truth was written across his face in lines of guilt. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I felt the stares of the cafe's few patrons on my back, though they weren't looking. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of every breath, every heartbeat. Finally, I whispered, "They were waiting for his death, weren't they?" Daniel flinched. His silence was answer enough. I stood, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from fury. The betrayal had a name, and now it had a witness. As I left the cafe, the air outside felt colder, sharper. The world looked the same, but I was not. I carried the confirmation with me, carved into my bones. Someone had loved him in secret, had waited patiently for the day he no longer belonged to me. And the cruelest part? He had let them. The world outside the cafe spun differently after that conversation with Daniel. Cars passed, people laughed, shops opened their doors. Life continued as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. My husband wasn't just gone. He had been living a hidden life that was now bleeding into mine. Back at home, I sat in the dim light of the living room with the will spread before me. The name stared up like an accusation. I spoke it aloud, and it filled the silence in a way that made the walls seem to lean closer, as though the house itself was listening. I tried to remember if I had ever heard it before. Maybe in passing, maybe in whispers, maybe even at gatherings where I hadn't been paying attention. The truth was painful. I couldn't place it. This wasn't some stranger in the dark. This was someone who had been close enough to be written into his will. Hours blurred into evening, and then the knock came. A soft, deliberate sound against the front door that made my chest tighten. I hesitated, every instinct telling me not to open it. But curiosity is cruel when it feeds on grief. I pulled the door open slowly. And there they were, the name made flesh. A woman stood on my doorstep, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. She clutched a small handbag, her posture stiff as though she had rehearsed this moment. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was electric, heavy with all the words that had been hidden for years. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said finally, her voice quiet, careful. It was the kind of sentence people repeat at funerals, but from her lips it felt sharper, almost cruel. I stepped aside slowly, allowing her in. My heart pounded as I closed the door behind us, sealing myself in with the very person who had waited for my husband's death. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the same table where I had spread the bank records, the will, the fragments of betrayal. Her eyes flickered to the papers, and I knew she recognized them. She didn't flinch, didn't deny it. "You knew him," I said, my voice breaking halfway. She nodded. "For years." The room tilted. I clutched the edge of the table to steady myself. "What were you to him?" Her lips pressed together. For a moment, she looked younger, almost fragile, like the weight of her own secret was suffocating her. Then softly, she said, "I was the one he couldn't let go of." The words slammed into me. Every letter, every number, every whisper suddenly crystallized. This was the person who had filled his late-night calls, his letters, his promises. She wasn't a stranger. She was the hidden half of his life. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "So, all those nights he told me he was working, it was you." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence was confirmation enough. I leaned back, my body trembling. For the first time, grief and rage stood side by side in my chest, two flames feeding each other. My husband had left me with a house full of shadows, but sitting across from me was the shadow itself, finally given a face. The woman lowered her gaze, her voice barely audible. "He always said he'd find a way. He promised me." Promised. That single word carried more weight than I could bear. I realized then that I had been living one life while my husband had been living two. And now, in his absence, those lives were colliding, mine and hers, like shattered glass scattering across the same floor. Her words sat between us like a blade, sharp, undeniable, waiting to cut deeper the more I looked at it. "He always said he'd find a way. He promised me." I wanted to scream, to demand how she could sit in my home, at my table, and speak of promises that had never belonged to her. But grief had stolen my voice, leaving only a quiet, shaking fury in its place. The woman, her name still tasted bitter on my tongue, shifted uncomfortably under my stare. She glanced at the papers spread across the table. The will, the bank statements, the letter. Her eyes lingered on the letter, and a faint tremor crossed her lips. "He told me you'd never understand." I let out a bitter laugh, one that cracked in the silence. "Understand what? That while I was building a life with him, he was building another with you? That the man I buried wasn't the man I married?" She flinched, but didn't look away. "It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that," I snapped, the words spilling out before I could stop them. My voice echoed in the room, bouncing off the walls that had once sheltered love, now suffocating me with betrayal. Her eyes softened then, and for a moment, I saw the grief etched in her face. Real grief. It startled me, because as much as I wanted to hate her, I realized she had lost him too. Not in the same way, not with the same weight, but her sorrow was real, raw. She hadn't just been waiting for my husband's death. She had been mourning him in silence long before I even knew the truth. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of letters, folded neatly and tied with a ribbon. She placed them on the table, pushing them toward me. "These were his," she whispered. "He wanted me to keep them, but I can't anymore. Maybe they'll give you answers." My fingers hovered above the ribbon, trembling. I didn't know if I could bear to untie it, to see his handwriting on pages meant for her, not me. But the temptation was unbearable. I tugged the ribbon loose, the letters spilling into my lap like ashes. Each page was a wound. His words were tender, filled with longing, filled with guilt. He wrote about promises of a future that never came, about nights spent wishing he could be with her, about the weight of living two lives. My heart cracked with each sentence because I recognized the handwriting, the phrasing, the man who had once written me notes filled with love. And yet, these words weren't mine. They never had been. The final letter was unfinished, the ink smudged, the sentences incomplete. "It won't be long now. Soon you'll have what you deserve. Just wait." The rest trailed off, a ghost of intention left unfinished by death. I clutched the letter to my chest, my tears falling freely now. Betrayal, grief, rage, they twisted together until I could no longer separate them. He had loved me, I believed that once. But he had also loved her, and perhaps in ways he could never admit to me. The woman sat across from me, silent, her own eyes wet. We were enemies, and yet, in that moment, we were bound by the same loss. We had both been lied to, in different ways. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It wasn't just numbers on a page, whispers at a funeral, or names in a will. It was here, tangible, written in his own hand. And the cruelest truth of all was this. I wasn't the only widow left behind. The house felt different after she left. Quieter, yet heavier, as though her presence had left an imprint in the walls, a reminder that my husband's life had stretched far beyond what I ever knew. The stack of letters sat on the table, their edges curled from the press of my trembling hands. They were proof of everything I had feared, proof that someone had not just loved him in secret, but had waited patiently for the day he no longer belonged to me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window with the letters spread across my lap, reading them again and again until the words blurred into each other. Each one told me the same story. He had been making promises for years, not weeks, not months, years. He had lived with me under one roof while another life unfolded in the shadows. The realization hollowed me. This hadn't been a sudden betrayal. It had been a slow, careful weaving of lies. And she, this woman, had been patient. So patient. She had carried his secrets with her, through dinners I hosted, through holidays I planned, through every smile I believed was real. In the gray light of dawn, I traced the timeline. The phone records, the bank transfers, the letters, they stretched back so far that I couldn't even remember what year it all began. Which anniversaries had been shared between us alone, and which had been shadowed by her presence. Which moments of tenderness had been mine, and which had been borrowed, destined to be written into letters for someone else. I thought back to his illness, the slow decline, the nights I sat by his side holding his hand. I had believed he was clinging to me, to us. But now I wondered, had his silences been filled with thoughts of her? Was she the one he pictured when he drifted in and out of consciousness? The cruelty of it struck me deeper than any grave. She hadn't just been waiting for his death. She had been waiting through his life, step by step, moment by moment, until the end. I stood and paced the room, the floorboards creaking beneath me. The house felt foreign, like every corner had been tainted by their secret. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to drown out the words of the last unfinished letter. It won't be long now. Soon you'll have what you deserve. Just wait. Wait. That word repeated in my mind until it became unbearable. She had waited, and he had known it. He had let her. I walked back to the dining table and stared at the papers scattered there. The will, the statements, the letters. Together, they formed a cruel truth, one that left me shaking. He had promised her something, not just love, something tangible, something worth her patience. As the morning sun pushed weakly through the curtains, I realized the weight of the choice before me. The secrets were no longer hidden. They were mine to carry, or mine to expose. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just grief anymore. This was a reckoning. Because when someone waits for death, they don't wait idly. They plan. They prepare. And the longer I stared at those letters, the more I understood. I had stepped into a story that was only just beginning to reveal its darkest truths. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and restless thought. I moved through the house like a ghost, carrying the weight of the letters, the will, the bank statements, every piece of evidence of a life I had never truly known. It felt like living inside a story where the ending had been written long before I ever realized it had begun. Each time I read his words, each time I whispered her name, a choice loomed before me. Do I bring it all into the light? Or do I bury it as he had and let the truth rot quietly in the dark? At night, I would sit by the fireplace, the flames flickering against my tired face, and imagine both paths. If I exposed everything, I could tear away the mask he had worn, show the world that the man they mourned was not who they thought he was. His memory would burn, but so would hers. They would both be stripped of the story they had built behind my back. But if I chose silence, the betrayal would linger only in me. I would carry it, alone, like a shadow I couldn't shake. The world would remember him as a husband, a friend, a good man, and she would carry the satisfaction of his promises fulfilled, the quiet victory of being named in his will, of receiving what she had waited for. The decision wasn't simple. It was a storm, one that raged every hour. Because silence would protect his legacy, but it would poison me. And truth would destroy everything, perhaps even me along with it. One evening, I found myself walking to the cemetery again. The air was heavy, the clouds thick above, as though the world itself held its breath. I stood by his grave, the flowers wilted, the soil still damp from recent rain. My voice cracked as I whispered, "Why? Why did you choose to love in halves?" The wind offered no answer, and yet, as I stood there, a strange calm settled in me. For the first time since his death, I realized this wasn't only about him, or even about her. It was about me, about who I would become now that the veil had been lifted. Grief had made me fragile, but betrayal had carved me into something sharper, stronger. I had been left with pieces of a story no one else could tell. The choice of what to do with it was mine alone. When I returned home, I gathered the papers, the letters, the will, and placed them in a box. I sat with it on my lap for a long time, my fingers brushing the lid. My heart pounded, torn between locking it away forever and walking out the door with it in my hands, ready to show the world. The choice wasn't made that night, but I knew I was closer to it. Because sometimes survival isn't just about enduring loss. It's about deciding what to do with the truth it leaves behind. And the truth was this: whether I exposed them or kept their secret, nothing would ever return me to the woman I had been before. The morning I finally let the house go quiet, the world outside seemed softer. Light poured gently through the curtains, no longer sharp, no longer accusatory, just light, as if reminding me that life continues even when hearts are broken. I sat by the window, the box of papers and letters resting on the table beside me. For days, I had lived with it, waited in my hands, debated its fate. But that morning, I simply let it sit, untouched. The urgency that once drove me to dig, to uncover, to demand answers had eased into something calmer, slower, like the tide retreating after a storm. I thought of him, my husband, as he was in the earliest years. The warmth of his laughter, the way he held my hand, the future we built in whispered plans. Those memories, though cracked now, still belonged to me. And nothing, not even betrayal, could erase them completely. I thought of her too, the other woman, the silent beneficiary, the one who had waited so patiently for his death. For years, I had unknowingly shared my life with her shadow. And now, even knowing her name, her face, her grief, I realized she too was trapped by his choices. She had waited in silence, carrying promises that may never have fully been hers. We were both widows. Two women tethered by a man who had lived two lives. The weight of that truth no longer pressed on me with the same suffocating force. Instead, it drifted around me like dust, always present, but no longer choking. I could breathe again, slowly, carefully. I walked through the house, touching the frames on the walls, the furniture worn by years of use, the small things that still carried his imprint. They were no longer sacred relics or poisoned reminders. They were just objects, part of a life that had ended. And mine, fragile as it still was, had to keep moving. When I returned to the table, I slid the box to the far corner. Not hidden, not destroyed, but set aside. A reminder that I could choose when, or if, to open it again. Outside, the garden had begun to bloom again. Roses opened their petals to the morning sun, unaware of human grief or secrets. I stepped out into the air, closed my eyes, and let the breeze brush against my skin. My story would not be defined by waiting, as hers had, nor by betrayal, as his was. It would be defined by survival, by the quiet strength of living on, even when the foundation had cracked beneath me. And so, I whispered into the morning light, softer than I had ever spoken before. Goodbye. Not bitter, not angry, just goodbye. The world didn't answer, but it didn't need to. Because in that moment, I knew the truth would always be there, folded into letters, etched into memories, whispered in the shadows. But I no longer had to carry it every second of every day. I could finally let myself breathe. Thank you for reading the whole story. Hope you will support my next products.